He did not offer her poetry. He did not promise her love. Jedediah Coulter offered Abigail Sterling a roof, protection, and respect. Nothing more. She accepted not as a helpless woman, but as a partner standing on equal ground. Yet somewhere between dusty trails, candlelit ledgers, and nights beneath the Texas stars, a practical deal began to soften into something neither of them expected. A love born not from passion alone, but from trust, honesty, and the courage to be seen.
The sun was a hammer. The dust was a shroud. Rattlesnake Flats didn't welcome you. It dared you to stay. Abigail Sterling stepped off the train. Her boots hit the boards. The wood was hot enough to blister. She adjusted her hat. She smoothed the skirt of her wedding dress. It was gray now. Once it had been white. Philadelphia was 1,000 miles away. Her old life was even further. She looked for a sign, a name, a face. Arthur Pringle was easy to spot. He smelled of cheap rye and old sweat. He looked at Abigail. Then he looked behind her. He was searching for someone else, someone younger, someone prettier. "You're Sterling?" Arthur asked. His voice was a rasp. "I am," Abigail said. She held her head high. "Abigail, your wife." Arthur spat. The tobacco hit the dust. It sizzled. "The hell you are," he said. The crowd gathered. They liked a show. "I paid for a girl, 19, fresh. You're a schoolmarm with lines on your face. You're plain as a fence post." Abigail didn't flinch. She didn't cry. "I am the woman who wrote the letters, Arthur. I am the woman who agreed to build a life with you." "Well, I'm unagreeing," Arthur barked. He laughed. The crowd joined in. "I don't need a teacher. I need a wife. Go back to the station. Sleep on the floor. I don't care where you go. You aren't mine." He turned his back. The humiliation was thick. It was heavy. It was the kind of shame that broke people. Then the boots started. Slow, steady, heavy enough to quiet the laughter. Jedediah Coulter stepped out of the shade. He was a big man, built like the mountains. His face was carved from granite. He stopped 5 feet from Abigail. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked at her. "A person's worth isn't found in their birth date, Arthur," Jedediah said. His voice was low, like thunder over the plains. "And a woman isn't a horse you trade at the fair based on her teeth and her coat. That's a lesson you should have learned before you put on long pants," Arthur grumbled. He moved away. He didn't want a fight with Jedediah. Nobody did. Jedediah turned to Abigail. He took off his hat. His hair was dark. His eyes were darker. "I have a problem, Miss Sterling," Jedediah said. "I have 10,000 mao of land. I have a father's will that says I must be a married man by the end of the month to keep it. It's a foolish rule, but it's the law." Abigail looked at him. She didn't look away. "And why tell me?" "Because you have a different problem," Jedediah said. "You have no home. You have no protector in a land that eats the unprotected. We can solve both." He paused. He let the wind howl between them. "I am offering a deal, not a romance. A partnership. You give me your name on a paper. I give you a roof. I give you safety. Most of all, I give you respect." He stepped a bit closer. He wanted her to hear the truth in his words. "We need to be clear on the value of a human soul, Abigail. In my house, there is a rule of equality. You will not be a servant. You will be a partner. Because a home isn't built on a husband's whim. It is built on the shared dignity of two people standing on the same ground. If you cannot have my heart yet, you will have my word. And my word is that you are an equal human being under this sun." The crowd was silent now, stunned. A rich man, a rejected bride, a bold deal. Abigail looked at the horizon. She looked at the dust. Then she looked at the man. "I am a teacher, Mr. Coulter," she said. "I believe in the power of the mind. If I stay, I will teach. I will speak. I will be a person of consequence. Is that part of your deal?" Jedediah nodded, once, firm. Knowledge is the only thing the powerful cannot take from the poor, he said. If you teach this town to think, you're doing God's work. I won't stop you. I'll give you the chalk. Abigail reached out her hand. It was steady. Then I need a home, she said, and it seems you need a wife. Jedediah took her hand. His grip was warm. It was sure. The deal was struck. The train hissed. The crowd watched. In Rattlesnake Flats, the world had just changed. They didn't know it yet. But Abigail Sterling was done being rejected. She was ready to be home. The wagon wheels groaned. The tall grass brushed against the wood. It sounded like a long, slow sigh. Rattlesnake Flats faded behind us. Ahead was only the horizon. The Texas sky was too big to understand. It made a person feel small. It made a person feel like a speck of dust. Jedediah Coulter didn't speak. He held the reins with steady hands. He didn't look at me. He looked at the trail. I sat beside him. My gray dress was stained with the red earth of the South. I didn't mind the silence. Silence in Philadelphia was a wall. Silence here was an opening. The ranch is another hour, Jed said. He didn't turn his head. My mother will be there, Martha. She's a good woman. She's seen the hard side of the world. I've seen it too, I said. I know. He snapped the reins. The horses picked up the pace. Mr. Coulter, I started. Jed. Jed, I corrected. We should be clear. About the house, about the life. He pulled the wagon to a halt. He didn't have to. But he did. He turned to look at me. The sun was hitting the side of his face. It showed the lines around his eyes. Those were lines earned by looking at the sun and the wind. Speak your mind, Abigail, he said. In this partnership, your voice has the same weight as mine. That's the first rule of an honest deal. I took a breath. The air tasted like sage and heat. I need you to understand something about the right to a person's own space, I said. My voice was firm. I am your wife on a piece of paper. I am the woman who will help you keep this land. But my body and my private thoughts belong to me alone. A home is not a place where one person rules over the other's spirit. That is a prison. A true home is built on the foundation of mutual consent. It is the verbal agreement that every human being has a right to their own physical and mental boundaries, regardless of a marriage contract. Jed listened. He didn't blink. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was weighing my words on a scale. I agree, he said. His voice was a low rumble. A man who forces his will on a woman isn't a man. He's a thief. He's stealing something that can only be given freely. You have your own room, you have your own time. I didn't bring you here to be a shadow. I brought you here to be a person. He reached into the back of the wagon. He pulled out a canteen. He offered it to me first. Respect isn't just a word we say to be polite, Abigail, Jed continued. It is a recognition of the inherent dignity in every soul. You are a teacher. You know that every child is born with the right to be treated as a whole human being. Adults are no different, we just forget it more often. I drank the water. It was cool. It was life. Thank you, I said. We moved again. The ranch appeared like a fortress of timber and stone. It was beautiful. It was lonely. Martha Coulter was waiting on the porch. She was a woman of silver hair and iron spine. She watched me climb down. She didn't look at my dress. She looked at my eyes. You're the one, Martha said. It wasn't a question. I am Abigail, I said. Martha stepped forward. She took my hands. Her palms were calloused. They felt like history. Jed told me about the deal, Martha whispered. He told me about the station. You have a look about you, Abigail. A look of someone who has lost everything but kept herself. That's the only thing worth keeping anyway. She led me inside. The house smelled of cedar and roasted coffee. It was clean. It was hollow. It needed a heartbeat. Later that night, I sat in my room. It was small. It had a window that faced the stars. I opened my trunk. I pulled out a book, a ledger. Not my letters. Not the fake life of Eleanor. I started to write. I wrote the numbers of the day, the miles traveled, the cost of the water, the temperature of the wind. There was a knock on the door. It was Martha. She had a tray with a cup of tea. She set it down. She looked at my book. She looked at the handwriting. Eleanor Grace Haynes had a messy hand, Martha said quietly. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the tea. She used to write to Horace. Her letters looked like a bird had walked across the page with ink on its feet. Your writing is like a map, precise, sure. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at her. Names are just labels we put on a jar, Abigail, Martha said. She finally met my eyes. What matters is the honey inside. I don't care what the paper says. I care what the woman does. But remember this. Truth is a debt we all eventually have to pay. The longer you wait to pay it, the higher the interest grows. Honesty isn't just about not lying. It's about having the courage to be seen for who you truly are. She walked out. She closed the door softly. I was alone with the stars, and the silence, and the truth I was holding in my hands. The morning came with a crack of gold. I didn't wait for a bell. I didn't wait for an invitation. I went to the kitchen. I made the bread. I fried the bacon. Jed came in at 5. He looked surprised. He looked tired. "You don't have to do the chores, Abigail," he said. He sat at the heavy oak table. "I don't do anything because I have to," I told him. I set a plate in front of him. "I do things because they need doing. That is the essence of responsibility. It is the choice to contribute to the whole without being told. That is how a society functions. That is how a ranch survives." Jed ate in silence. He watched me move. I wasn't just cooking. I was counting. I was measuring the flour by sight. I was timing the eggs by the beat of my own heart. "After breakfast," I said, "I want to see the books." Jed paused. His fork hovered. "The books?" "The ledgers, the accounts, the taxes. You said I was a partner. A partner needs to know the numbers. Numbers don't lie. People do. Numbers are the only language that remains the same regardless of who is speaking." Jed took me to a small office. It was tucked behind the parlor. It was thick with dust. It was thick with confusion. There were stacks of paper. There were receipts from 3 years ago. There were notes scrawled on the backs of envelopes. "I'm a cattleman, Abigail," Jed said. He looked ashamed. "I know the weight of a steer by looking at it. I know the health of the grass by the color. But these pages, they look like a language I never learned." I sat at the desk. I opened the first ledger. "Sit down, Jed," I said. He sat. I flipped the pages. 1, 2, 3. I didn't stop to read. I just looked. I let the images burn into the back of my mind. The dates, the dollar signs, the names of the merchants, the signatures. I closed the book. I looked at the wall. I saw the page in my mind. Every line, every ink blot. "You bought 50 head of Hereford cattle in June of last year," I said, "from a man named Miller. You paid $12 a head, but the receipt in the other pile says you paid 14. There is a $2 gap for every cow. That is $100, Jed. That is a month's wages for 3 men." Jed leaned forward. "How did you do that? You just glanced at it." "I have a gift," I said. "Some people remember a melody, some people remember a face. I remember the written word. It stays with me, like a photograph." I turned to him. This was the moment, the lesson. "Knowledge is the most powerful tool a person can own," I said. "And literacy is the gatekeeper to that power. You are a rich man in land, Jed, but you are a poor man in information. That makes you vulnerable. When a person cannot read their own contracts, they are giving their freedom to someone else. They are allowing others to define their reality. Literacy isn't just about books and poetry. It is about the fundamental right to self-defense. If you cannot read the law, you cannot claim its protection. If you cannot count your own money, you are at the mercy of those who can." Jed rubbed his face. He looked at the stacks of paper. He looked at me with a new kind of intensity. "I never thought of it that way," he whispered. "I thought it was just for clerks and city folk." "It is for everyone who wants to be free," I said. "Tomorrow we start a class. Not just for you, for the hands, for the boys in the bunkhouse. We will turn this ranch into a place where no one can be cheated because they didn't know how to read the price." "They won't like it," Jed said. "They're men of action, not men of the pen." "Action without understanding is just flailing in the dark," I countered. "We will explain the value. We will show them that a pen can be sharper than a knife when it comes to keeping what is yours. That is a lesson in human rights, Jed. The right to be informed, the right to understand the world you live in." I spent the rest of the day in that office. I organized the chaos. I found more gaps. I found signatures that didn't match. I found the name Silas Vance over and over again. Silas Vance, the deputy, the man who had smiled when I was rejected at the station. He was skimming. He was taking a little bit of the Coulter legacy every month. He was counting on Jed's silence. He was counting on Jed's inability to see the pattern. I walked out to the porch as the sun began to dip. The sky was a bruised purple. Jed was leaning against a post. He was looking at his land. "I found it, Jed," I said. "Found what?" "The leak. The thief." "It's the law." Jed went stiff. His hands balled into fists. "Vance?" "Yes, he's been taking from the tax fund. He's been charging you for land that is already yours. He's been using the complexity of the law to blind you to the theft." Jed looked at me. There was a fire in his eyes now. It wasn't the fire of a businessman. It was the fire of a man who had finally been given a map. "What do we do?" he asked. "We wait," I said. "We learn. We gather the proof. And then we show this town that a woman from the East and a cowboy from the West are a force that can't be broken by a crooked badge." I looked at him, truly looked at him. "This is the beginning of our real marriage, Jed," I said. "The marriage of purpose, because a true partnership is built on the shared pursuit of justice. It is the verbal commitment to stand together against those who would exploit the weak or the unlearned. We aren't just saving a ranch. We are standing up for the principle that honesty must be the currency of our lives." Jed nodded. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The wind carried our silent agreement across the plains. We were no longer strangers sharing a wagon. We were a team, and we were coming for the truth. The stars over Texas are different. They don't just sit there. They pulse. They feel close enough to touch, yet far enough to make you feel like nothing at all. I sat on the porch steps. The wood was still warm from the day's heat. Jed sat a few feet away. He was cleaning his rifle. The metallic click-slide of the bolt was the only music we had. It was a rhythm I was starting to know. "I remember the first time I saw you," Jed said. He didn't look up from the barrel. My breath hitched. My mind, that restless librarian, started flipping through pages. I knew I hadn't met him, not as Abigail Sterling, but I was playing a part. I was Eleanor Haynes. "Is that so?" I kept my voice light. "Abilene," Jed said. He stopped scrubbing. He looked at the horizon. 8 years ago, the autumn fair. You were wearing a yellow ribbon. You were selling used books at a stall near the livery." I didn't answer. Not yet. I ran the data. Eleanor Haynes in 1870. She was in Philadelphia. She was recovering from a broken leg. She never went to Abilene. And Eleanor hated yellow. She told me once it reminded her of sickness. I looked at Jed. He was watching me. It wasn't a soft look, it was a test. A hunter watching a deer step into a clearing. "I wasn't in Abilene in 1870, Jed," I said. My voice didn't shake. "And I have never owned a yellow ribbon. Eleanor Haynes was in a bed in Pennsylvania that year, and she wouldn't have been selling books. She would have been hiding from them." Jed went back to his rifle. The tension in his shoulders dropped, just an inch. "Good," he whispered. "I like a woman who doesn't agree with a lie just to be agreeable." I stood up. I walked over and sat on the bench near him. "Why did you do that?" I asked. "To see if I was a liar?" "To see if you were a good liar," Jed corrected. He set the rifle down. "Most people will steal a memory if you offer it to them. They want to belong so badly they'll claim a past that isn't theirs. But a person who steals a memory is stealing their own identity. They are trading their truth for a moment of comfort. And in this land, comfort will kill you faster than a rattlesnake." I looked at the stars. I felt the weight of my own secret. My name. "Jed," I said. "We need to talk about why the truth matters. Verbally. Out loud." He leaned back. He gave me his full attention. "The truth is the only anchor we have in a world built on shifting sand," I said. I looked him right in the eye. Every time a person tells a lie, they are chipping away at the foundation of their own character. They are saying that reality isn't good enough for them. But here is the deeper lesson, Jed. Honesty is a human right. We have a right to know the ground we stand on. When you lie to someone, you are robbing them of their ability to make a choice based on facts. You are taking away their agency. You are treating them like a child or a slave. To be truthful is to respect the other person's right to live in the real world." Jed nodded. He took a long, slow breath. "I grew up around men who used words like cattle," Jed said. "They'd brand them, they'd hide them, they'd steal them. My wife, Margaret, she was the best at it. She didn't tell big lies. She told small ones. She'd say she was happy when she was packing a bag. She'd say she loved the land when she was dreaming of the city. By the time she left, I didn't know what was real anymore. I felt like I was living in a ghost story." He looked at his hands, rough, scarred. "I realized then," Jed continued, "that a person's word is the only thing they truly own. You can lose your ranch, you can lose your cattle, but no one can take your word from you. You have to give it away. And once you give it away, you're just an empty shell. Authenticity isn't a luxury, Abigail. It's a survival skill. If I can't trust the map you give me, I'm going to end up off a cliff. And I need a partner who can draw a straight line." "I am drawing one now," I said. "I know you are," Jed said. There was a pause, a long one. The crickets filled the space. "Abigail," he said, "the will. My father, he didn't just want me to be married, he wanted me to be changed. He knew I was turning into stone. He knew I was closing every door and bolting every window. He put that clause in the will because he knew that the only way to save a man like me was to force him to be responsible for someone else. He wanted me to learn that a life lived only for oneself is a life that isn't lived at all." "He was a wise man," I said. "He was a hard man," Jed corrected. "But he knew that a human being's greatest duty is to be a witness to another person's life, to say, 'I see you, I hear you, you matter.' He knew I couldn't do that alone." I reached out. I didn't touch his hand, not yet. But I sat close. "We are witnesses now, Jed," I said, "to the truth, and to each other." He picked up his rifle. He stood up. "Sleep well, Abigail," he said. "You too, Jed." I watched him go inside. I stayed on the porch. I thought about the yellow ribbon I never had, and the man who was slowly, carefully, opening a window to let in the light. The town of Rattlesnake Flats felt different when you were riding in as the wife of Jedediah Coulter. The dust seemed to settle faster. The eyes on the street didn't linger as long. Or maybe I just didn't care. I had a ledger in my head. I had a purpose in my heart. We walked into the land office. It was a small, cramped building. It smelled of ink and old paper. Silas Vance was sitting behind a mahogany desk. He looked up. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that made you want to check your pockets. "Jedediah," Silas said. He stood up. He adjusted his vest. He wore a star on his chest that looked too shiny for the work he did. "And the new Mrs. Coulter. Welcome. I trust the ranch is, holding up?" "It's holding up, Silas," Jed said. His voice was like a low growl. We're here to settle the back taxes on the North grazing land. Silas pulled out a heavy book. He flipped the pages with practiced ease. Ah, yes, Silas said. The Northland. There's been a adjustment. New county ordinance. You owe $480, plus the filing fee. I saw Jed's jaw tighten. I stepped forward. Mr. Vance, I said. My voice was calm, like a teacher explaining a simple sum. May I see that ordinance? Silas blinked. His smile twitched. It's a matter of public record, ma'am, but it's quite technical. Lots of legal phrasing. I like legal phrasing, I said. I find it very precise. He slid a paper across the desk. I looked at it. I didn't just read it. I recorded it. I looked at the date. I looked at the seal. I looked at the wording of paragraph 3. This ordinance applies to land improvements made after 1875, I said. I looked up at him. The North grazing land hasn't been improved since 1872. The well was dug then. The fencing was completed then. Under this very law, the Coulter Ranch is exempt from this adjustment. The office went silent. Jed looked at me. Silas looked at the paper. You must have misread it, Silas said. He tried to pull the paper back. I held it down with one finger. I don't misread, Mr. Vance, I said. I have a photographic memory. I remember every word on this page. And I remember the ledger in Jed's office. I remember that you charged him this same adjustment last year, and the year before. Except the ordinance didn't exist 2 years ago. It was passed 6 months ago. Silas's face went pale. Then it went red. Now see here? No, you see here, I interrupted. I leaned in. We need to talk about the moral obligation of power, I said. And we need to talk about it right now. When a man puts on a badge or sits behind a desk of authority, he is entering into a sacred trust with the community. He is saying, I will be the guardian of the rules we all live by. When that man uses his knowledge to trick the unlearned, he is committing a crime worse than theft. He is committing treason against the social contract. I pointed to the shiny star on his chest. Corruption thrives in the dark spaces between what a person knows and what they are told, I continued. Literacy and numeracy are not just school subjects, Silas. They are the tools of justice. When you hide the truth in technical phrasing, you are trying to keep people in the dark so you can pick their pockets. But a human being has a right to an honest accounting. They have a right to understand the laws that govern their lives. To intentionally confuse someone for your own profit is a violation of their basic dignity. It is an act of cowardice. Jed stepped forward. He put a hand on the desk. The wood groaned under the pressure. The lady is right, Silas, Jed said. And she has the numbers, every single one of them. Silas looked between us. He saw the fire in my eyes. He saw the iron in Jed's. There must have been a clerical error, Silas stammered. He started scribbling on a piece of paper. I'll fix it. I'll issue a credit. You'll issue a refund, I said, for the last 3 years, and you'll do it today. Silas didn't argue. He wrote the check. His hand was shaking. We walked out of the office into the bright Texas sun. The air felt cleaner. Jed stopped on the sidewalk. He looked down at me. I've lived here all my life, Jed said. And I never knew a woman could fight like that with nothing but words. Words are the only things that truly change the world, Jed, I told him. Guns just stop it for a while, but a word can build a bridge, or it can tear down a wall. We walked toward the wagon. Abigail, Jed said. He stopped. What you said in there? About the social contract, and the right to understand. You really believe that? With every fiber of my being, I said. In Philadelphia, I saw families lose everything because they couldn't read the fine print on a loan. I saw men work themselves to death for wages they couldn't count. I realized then that ignorance isn't just a lack of schooling, it's a cage. And the people who hold the keys are usually the ones who benefit from the lock. I looked at the town, the people going about their business. We have a responsibility, Jed, I said. Those of us who can read, those of us who can see the patterns, we have a duty to protect those who can't, not out of pity, but out of respect, because every person deserves to stand on honest ground. That is the only way a community grows. It's the only way a home becomes more than just a house. Jed climbed into the wagon. He reached down and helped me up. I think I'm starting to understand why you're here, Jed said. To keep your land? I asked. No, Jed said. He snapped the reins. To teach me how to be a citizen of the world again. Not just a man on a ranch, but a man who belongs to something bigger. We drove out of town. The dust rose up behind us. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a shroud. It felt like a path. Tomorrow, I said as we reached the gates of the ranch. We start the classes for the men. We'll teach them to read the receipts. We'll teach them to count the weight of the grain. They'll be scared, Jed said. Fear is just the feeling of a cage you haven't opened yet, I said. Once they see the light, they'll never want the dark again. Jed looked at the horizon. Neither do I, Abigail, he whispered. Neither do I. The bunkhouse smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the heavy scent of men who had worked 15 hours in the sun. It was a low building, sturdy, but it felt small when I stepped through the door. 10 pairs of eyes turned toward me. They weren't friendly eyes, they weren't hostile either, they were guarded, like cattle watching a new dog in the yard. Jed stood behind me, his presence was a silent anchor. Evening, boys, Jed said. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. Evening, boss, a man named Sam said. He was the oldest of the lot. His skin looked like a map of a dry creek bed. He was holding a piece of harness he was trying to mend. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked to the center of the room. I set a stack of slates and a box of chalk on the long dining table. The sound of the wood hitting wood was sharp. It was a call to order. I'm told most of you can't read the contracts you signed to work here, I said. No preamble, no honeyed words. One of the younger men, a boy named Billy, laughed. It was a nervous sound. Don't need to read, ma'am. I know how to ride. I know how to rope. I looked at him. I let the silence hang for a beat. 2 beats. Roping a steer keeps you fed today, Billy, I said. But understanding a contract keeps you free tomorrow. That is the lesson we are here to learn. We need to talk about the fundamental connection between literacy and human autonomy. Out loud. So there is no mistake. I looked around the room. I made sure I caught every man's gaze. Literacy is not a luxury for the rich, I said. It is the primary tool for self-governance. When you cannot read the words that govern your labor, you are living under the shadow of another man's whim. You are essentially giving away your right to informed consent. To sign your name with an X is to admit that you do not own the terms of your own life. It is a surrender of your dignity as an individual. Every person has a right to know exactly what they are agreeing to. If you remain illiterate, you are choosing to be a victim of anyone who knows more than you do. Sam stopped working on the harness. He looked at the slate on the table. Then he looked at his own calloused hands. The deputy, Vance, Sam said quietly. He came by last month, had us sign some papers for the census, said it was just to count heads. It wasn't a census, Sam, Jed said from the doorway. It was a waiver for your water rights on the back creek. He's trying to sell the flow to the railroad. The room went cold. It was the kind of cold that starts in the gut. He lied to us, Billy whispered. He didn't lie, I corrected. He just showed you a page he knew you couldn't read. He used your lack of education as a cage, and he did it because he thinks you aren't worth the truth. But you are. Every human being has a right to be equipped with the skills necessary to protect their own interests. That is why we are here tonight. Education is the great equalizer. It is the only way to ensure that the man in the fine suit cannot steal the boots off the man in the saddle. I picked up a piece of chalk. I wrote a single word on the largest slate. Dignity. This is the first word, I said. It starts with a D, like the D in debt, or the D in deal. If you can't see the difference between them on paper, you'll never see the difference in your life. I handed a slate to Billy. He took it like it was made of glass. "Why you doing this?" Sam asked. He looked at Jed. "Boss, why letter?" "Because a ranch of blind men is a ranch that belongs to Silas Vance," Jed said. "And because my wife is right. A man who can't read his own name is a man who can't hold his own ground." We stayed in that bunkhouse for 3 hours. I showed them the alphabet. I showed them how sounds turned into symbols. It was hard work, harder than breaking colts. Their fingers were stiff, their eyes were tired. But something was shifting. By the time the lamp flickered low, Billy had written his own name. He stared at it for a long time. "That's me," he whispered. "That is your identity, Billy," I said. "And once you can write it, you can defend it. We are talking about the right to self-representation. When you can state your own name and read your own terms, you are no longer a piece of equipment on this ranch. You are a participant in a society of laws. To be educated is to be empowered to speak for yourself, rather than being spoken for." I walked back to the main house with Jed. The moon was a silver coin in the black sky. "They did well," Jed said. "They did better than well," I said. "They started to see the bars of the cage. That's the first step to breaking them." "You have a way of making it sound like a war, Abigail," Jed said. "It is a war, Jed," I told him. "A war between those who want to control and those who want to be free. And in that war, a library is more dangerous than an armory." Jed didn't say anything. He just took my hand. It was the first time he had done it without a reason. Just a touch, person to person. We were standing on honest ground, and for the first time it felt like the ground was holding us back. A week later, the storm broke. Not a storm of rain, a storm of paper. A rider came from town. He didn't stop to say hello. He threw a heavy envelope onto the porch and spurred his horse back toward Rattlesnake Flats. Jed picked it up. His face went white as a bleached bone. "It's a notice of foreclosure," Jed said. His voice was flat, dead. "The bank in Abilene. They say I'm 6 months behind on the mortgage for the Valley section. They say I missed the payment in January." "January," I said. I closed my eyes. I reached back into the archives of my mind. "January 3rd, you were in town. You went to the bank. You told me about it." "I did," Jed said. "I paid Harrison himself, $340, in cash. He gave me a receipt." "Where is it?" Jed went to his office. He hunted through the drawers. He tore through the files I had organized. It wasn't there. The folder for January was empty. "Silas," I whispered. "He was here," Jed said. He sat down heavily. "He came by 2 weeks ago. Said he was checking the ranch security. I left him in the office for 10 minutes while I went to the barn." "10 minutes is enough time to change a life," I said. We drove to town. We didn't take the wagon. We took the fast horses. The air was hot and thick. It felt like the world was holding its breath. The First Bank of Abilene's local branch was a cold building, stone walls, brass bars. It felt like a place designed to make a man feel small. Mr. Harrison was behind the counter. He looked like a man who had been told to be sad but was mostly just busy. "I'm sorry, Jedediah," Harrison said. He didn't look Jed in the eye. "No receipt, no proof. The ledger says the January line is blank. Without that payment, the default clause kicks in. Silas Vance has already filed the intent to purchase the lien." "Silas Vance is a thief," Jed growled. "That's a heavy word, Jed," Harrison said, "unless you have a heavy proof." I stepped forward. I took a deep breath. I felt the weight of every page I had ever read. "Mr. Harrison," I said, "we need to speak about the moral weight of truth and the power of intellectual self-defense, verbally, right now, because a ledger is not the law. The truth is the law." Harrison looked at me. He looked annoyed. "Ma'am, this is a banking matter." "It is a human matter," I countered. "When a system is designed to favor the person with the pen over the person with the plow, It is a system that has lost its moral compass. But here is the lesson, sir. Every action leaves a trail. Every truth leaves a footprint. You say the January line is blank, but I have seen a ledger you don't know I saw. 3 weeks ago, when I was in the land office, Silas Vance left a private ledger open on his desk. I didn't mean to see it, but I see everything. I have a photographic memory. Harrison's eyes narrowed. What does Silas's private ledger have to do with this bank? Everything, I said. Because on page 42 of that ledger, there is a list of internal deposits. One of those deposits was made on January 4th. The amount was $340. And there was a note next to it, a check number 0092, from this bank, to Silas Vance, signed by you. The room went silent. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking like a heart. Check 0092? Harrison whispered. Yes, I said. A check drawn on the bank's internal account. The kind of check you issue when someone brings in cash and wants to verify it before it's deposited. You didn't leave the January line blank because the money wasn't there. You left it blank because you issued a bank check to Silas, instead of putting it in the Coulter account. You were part of it, Harrison, or you were too lazy to notice you were being used. I leaned in. I didn't blink. We are talking about the right to a fair and honest accounting, I said. My voice was like a knife. An individual has a fundamental right to the integrity of their financial records. When a bank colludes with a corrupt official to strip a man of his land, it is a violation of the most basic human rights. It is a theft of a man's future. But intellectual self-defense means I don't have to take your word for it. I have my own record. I have the memory of that check. And if you don't find that internal ledger right now, I will tell every rancher in this county that their money is being used to fuel Silas Vance's greed. Harrison's face went from pale to gray. He looked at Jed. He looked at me. He saw that I wasn't guessing. He saw that I was recording him. Wait here, Harrison said. He went into the back vault. We waited 10 minutes, 15. When he came back, he was holding a small blue book. His hands were shaking. I found it, Harrison said. There was a misfiling. The cash was received. The check was issued to the land office as a holding fee. It was never intended to be a final payment. Silas told me it was a special tax. Silas told you a lie, Jed said. He reached across the counter and grabbed the blue book. He looked at the entry, 0092. It's here, Jed whispered. Yes, I said. The truth doesn't evaporate, Jed. It just waits for someone to remember it. I turned back to Harrison. You will cancel the foreclosure, I said. You will issue a formal apology to Mr. Coulter, and you will provide a signed statement regarding Silas Vance's holding fee. If you don't, the next person you talk to will be a federal judge. I'll do it, Harrison said. I'll do it right now. We walked out of the bank. The air felt lighter. The sun didn't feel quite so hot. Jed stopped on the sidewalk. He looked at me for a long time. It wasn't the look of a partner. It wasn't the look of a rancher. It was something else. You saved it, Jed said. You saved everything. I didn't save it, Jed, I said. The truth saved it. I just held the light so you could see it. We need to understand that the power to remember is the power to resist. If we let others tell our story, they will always make us the villains or the victims. But when we hold on to our own facts, we hold on to our own lives. Jed took a step closer. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating off him. Abigail, he said. His voice was low. That ledger you saw, in Silas's office. How long were you looking at it? I paused. I felt the weight of my secret again. 3 seconds, I said. Jed looked at me, truly looked at me. Not as a teacher, not as a wife, but as a mystery he was finally starting to solve. You aren't just a teacher from Philadelphia, are you? He asked. I am exactly who I am, Jed, I said. A woman who doesn't like to be lied to, and a woman who knows that an honest home is worth more than 10,000 maw of gold. Jed didn't ask more. He didn't have to. He just put his arm around my shoulders and walked me to the horses. We were going home, not to a house, not to a deal. to a home. But as we rode out of town, I saw Silas Vance standing in the shadow of the saloon. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked like a man who had lost a hand of cards but was already reaching for a hidden gun. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I had a partner. And I had the truth. And in the West, that's all a person ever really needs. The dust in Texas tells stories. Most of the time it tells you about the wind. Sometimes it tells you about rain that isn't coming. But today, the dust rising on the South Trail told me about trouble. It was a lone rider, followed by a buggy. They weren't moving with the steady pace of a neighbor. They were moving with the frantic energy of a man who thought he was late for a hanging. I stood on the porch. My hands were dusted with flour. I was thinking about the bunkhouse boys, about how Billy had looked at his own name. I was thinking about the power of a single word. Then the buggy pulled into the yard. Silas Vance sat in the seat. He looked smug. Beside him sat a man who looked like he had been dragged through a hedge. A man in a suit that cost more than a year of my teaching salary. A man with a face I knew better than my own. Caleb Sterling, my brother. The air went still. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a lightning strike. Jed walked out from the barn. He didn't have his rifle, but he had his hands resting on his belt. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Caleb, then he looked at me. "Coulter," Silas called out. He didn't get down. He liked the height of the seat. "I believe we have a small matter of identity to settle. This here is Mr. Caleb Sterling from Philadelphia. He's looking for his sister." Caleb stepped down. His boots were polished, too polished for the dirt. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and greed. "Abby," Caleb said. His voice was thin. "What have you done?" I didn't move. I didn't blink. I let the weight of the moment settle. "I have survived, Caleb," I said. "Something you wouldn't know much about." Silas laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. "You hear that, Jedediah? Abigail, not Eleanor. This woman is a fraud. She's been living in your house, eating your bread, and signed your marriage license under a dead woman's name. That makes your deal void, and it makes her a criminal." Jed didn't move. He stood like an oak tree in a gale. He looked at Caleb. "Is this your sister?" Jed asked. "She is," Caleb said. He wouldn't look Jed in the eye. "Abigail Sterling. My sister Eleanor passed away in February. Abby took her papers. She took the inheritance letter. She's always been ambitious." Silas turned back to Jed. "The law is clear, Jed. A contract signed under a false identity is no contract at all. The ranch goes back to the state, and the lady goes to the county jail." Jed took a slow step forward. He looked at Silas. Then he turned to me. "Abigail," Jed said. He used my real name. It sounded like a prayer. "Is it true?" "It is true," I said. I stepped off the porch. I stood on the dirt. "I am Abigail Sterling. Eleanor was my cousin. She died in my arms. I took her place because I had nothing left. I took it because the world had decided I didn't matter. I lied about my name." I looked at Silas. "But I never lied about the man you are, Silas," I said. I turned back to Jed. I needed to say this. I needed the educational weight of the moment to be clear. "Jed," I said, "we need to speak about the difference between a legal truth and a moral truth. Out loud. For everyone to hear. Because a name is just a label. It is a piece of ink on a piece of paper. The law uses names to track us, to tax us, and to cage us. But a human being's value is found in their character, not their nomenclature. Your reputation is what people whisper in the saloon. Your character is what you do when you think no one is watching. I may have failed the legal truth. I used a name that wasn't mine. But I have upheld the moral truth of this ranch. I have protected your land. I have taught your men. I have stood by you when the dark was closing in." I looked at Caleb. "Loyalty is a human right, Jed," I continued. "We have a right to expect it from those we break bread with. My brother here has sold his loyalty for a handful of Silas's promises. He has traded the truth of our blood for the lie of a payday. That is a violation of the most basic human duty. To choose a law that hurts people over a truth that saves them is a sign of a soul that has gone sour. A man who follows the letter of the law while stepping on the heart of a person is no man at all. Silas sneered. Save the schoolroom talk for the judge, Abby. Jed, the law says... I know what the law says, Silas, Jed interrupted. He looked at me. His eyes were soft. But the law didn't pull Sam out of that creek last week. The law didn't teach Billy how to sign his name. The law didn't find the missing check in Harrison's ledger. A woman did. A woman who worked harder for this land than anyone I've ever known. Jed turned to Caleb. Mr. Sterling, Jed said, you say she's your sister. You say she's a fraud. But I see a woman who stood her ground when her own blood ran away. I see a woman who didn't ask for a handout but asked for a deal. And in the West, a deal is a sacred thing. It's more than a name. It's a promise of presence. Jed looked back at Silas. She stays, Jed said. You can't do that, Silas shouted. The deed is in my name, Jed said. And the woman who helped me save it is standing right here. You want to take her? You'll have to go through me. And I think you know how that ends. Silas Vance looked at Jed. He looked at the bunkhouse where the men were starting to gather. Billy was holding a rope. Sam was holding a pitchfork. They weren't looking at Silas with respect. They were looking at him like a predator they were ready to drive off. This isn't over, Silas spat. He climbed back into the buggy. Caleb, get in. We're going to the circuit judge. Caleb didn't look at me. He scrambled into the seat. They drove out of the yard, the dust rising behind them like a ghost. The yard went quiet again. Jed walked over to me. He didn't touch me, not yet. Abigail, he said. I'm sorry I didn't tell you, Jed, I whispered. I knew, he said. I looked at him. You knew? Martha told me, Jed said. She knew the first week. She said your heart was too big for a lie to hide it. She said to wait. She said a person should be allowed to choose their own time to be seen. He looked at the trail where the buggy had disappeared. We need to understand something, Abigail, Jed said. Trust isn't a destination, it's a practice. It is the verbal and active choice to believe in someone's potential even when their past is messy. You gave me your loyalty. That's the only currency that matters in a place as hard as this. To judge a person by their lowest moment instead of their highest purpose is a failure of empathy. And empathy is the only thing that keeps us human when the wind starts to howl. I felt the tears then, for the first time. They weren't tears of shame. They were tears of relief. I'm still Abigail Sterling, I said. I know, Jed said. He reached out and wiped a stray tear from my cheek. And I think I'm starting to like her even better than Eleanor. He turned to the men in the yard. Back to work, boys, Jed called. We've got a ranch to run, and we've got a truth to protect. The men moved. Billy gave me a small nod. Sam tipped his hat. I wasn't a fraud. I wasn't a ghost. I was Abigail. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The morning after Caleb left was cold. A blue north wind was biting at the eaves of the house. I was in the kitchen sitting with Martha. We were drinking coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Jed was out in the barn, checking the horses. The house felt different. The air was cleared of the secret. But the danger from Silas was still hanging over us like a black cloud. Martha set her cup down. She looked at me with those ancient, wise eyes. It's time, Abigail, Martha said. She stood up and went to a small wooden box on the mantel. She pulled out a letter. It was yellowed. The ink was faded. The handwriting was a wild, energetic scrawl. This is from Horace, Martha said. My brother, the man who wrote the will. I took the letter. My fingers brushed the paper. I felt a chill. He wrote this 6 months before he passed, Martha said. He sent it to me. He told me to keep it until the right soul arrived. He didn't say the right name. He said the right soul. I opened the letter. I read it. I didn't just read it. I recorded it into the library of my mind. Dear Martha, I know the lawyers are going to make a mess of things once I'm gone. They love their rules. They love their straight lines. But life isn't a straight line. It's a cattle trail. And sometimes the best path is the one that zigzags. I put that marriage clause in the will for Jed. He's a good boy, but he's got a heart like a frozen pond. He needs someone to break the ice. I named Eleanor Haynes because she was the only family left on the other side. But listen to me, Martha. If Eleanor don't make it, and she's a sickly thing, I know, don't let the lawyers steal the land. The law is a servant, not a master. Its purpose is to provide a framework for human flourishing, not to act as a trap for the desperate. If someone else comes, someone who needs a home as much as Jed needs a wife, let them stay. If they have the grit to stand on that porch and face the wind, they are the one I want. A person's right to a home is more important than the spelling of their name on a deed. Tell Jed that the C. Haynes in the Dichuk wasn't a requirement, it was a suggestion. The only real requirement is that he finds a partner who knows the value of the ground they stand on. Tell him I'm sorry for being a hard old man, but tell him I believe in him. Your brother, Horace. I looked up. My eyes were stinging. He knew, I whispered. He knew that life is messy, Martha said. And he knew that the purpose of an inheritance isn't to preserve a name, but to preserve a community. Horace believed in the moral principle of common-sense equity. It is the idea that the spirit of an agreement is more important than the letter of the document. When a rule stops serving the people it was meant to protect, it becomes an injustice. To hold on to a technicality while a human life is destroyed is a moral failing. Horace wanted a partner for Jed. He found one. I stood up. I felt a surge of strength. We need to go to town, I said, right now. What for? The town council meeting, I said. Silas Vance is planning to use the technicality to strip Jed of the ranch today. He's going to use the letter of the law to commit a robbery. But we have the spirit of the law in our hands. We found Jed. We showed him the letter. He read it in silence. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were bright. We drove to Rattlesnake Flats. The town council was meeting in the back of the general store. It was crowded. Silas Vance was there, standing next to a circuit judge. Caleb was hovering in the background, looking like he wanted to be invisible. The matter is simple, Judge, Silas was saying. His voice was loud, confident. The marriage is a fraud. The will has been violated. The Coulter Ranch is currently without a legal heir. Under the homestead statutes, the land should be open for auction. I have the paperwork ready. Jed walked into the room. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the front. The land is not for auction, Silas, Jed said. Jedediah, the judge said. He looked tired. The law is quite clear. If the conditions of the will aren't met, the conditions have been met, I said. I stepped forward. I held up Horace's letter. I am Abigail Sterling, I said. I looked at the judge. I looked at the crowd. And I am here to speak about the true purpose of the law out loud. So there is no confusion. The room went silent. Silas tried to speak, but the judge held up a hand. Go on, ma'am, the judge said. The law exists to protect the rights of the living, not to serve the whims of the dead or the greed of the corrupt, I said. I felt the rhythmic beat of my heart. We have a right to a legal system that recognizes human intent. This letter, written by Horace Coulter himself, clarifies the intent of his will. He didn't want a name. He wanted a partner for his son. He wanted someone who would care for this land and the people on it. I have done that. I have fulfilled the moral and practical requirements of this inheritance. I looked at Silas. To use a technicality to ruin a man's life is not an act of law, I continued. It is an act of malice. We must understand that the letter of the law is a cage if it isn't guided by the light of justice. Justice is the verbal and active commitment to doing what is right, even when it is complicated. To allow Silas Vance to steal 10,000 mow of land because of a spelling error or a change in person is to mock the very idea of fairness. It is a violation of the principle that the law should serve the common good. We are here to uphold the legacy of a man who loved this land, not the greed of a man who wants to pave it. I handed the letter to the judge. He read it slowly. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at Jed. "This is a clear statement of intent," the judge said. "And in a court of equity, intent is everything." The judge looked at Silas. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, "it seems your technicality has evaporated. The will stands. The marriage, while unconventional in its naming, is recognized by the intent of the benefactor. The Coulter Ranch remains with Jedediah Coulter and his wife." The room erupted, not with cheers, but with a low murmur of agreement. People were looking at Silas with suspicion. They were looking at Jed with respect. Silas Vance went purple. He grabbed his hat and stomped out of the room. Caleb Sterling followed him, ducking his head. We walked out of the store. The Texas sun was bright. The wind was still blowing, but it didn't feel cold anymore. Jed stopped me on the sidewalk. He took both of my hands. "You did it again," he said. "We did it, Jed," I said. "And Horace did it. He was looking out for you all along." Jed looked at the horizon. "I think I'm ready to stop being a ghost, Abigail," Jed said. "I'm ready to be a man with a name, and a man with a wife." He looked at me, truly looked at me. "Abigail Sterling," he said. "Will you stay? Not because of a deal, not because of a will, but because you choose to?" I looked at the town. I looked at the dust. I looked at the man who had become my anchor. "I choose to stay, Jed," I said. "Because a home isn't where you find yourself. It's where you decide to stand. We have a right to choose our own belonging. And I belong here, with you, on honest ground." Jed smiled. It was a real smile. It reached his eyes. "Then let's go home," he said. We rode back to the ranch. The cattle were grazing. The men were working. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors I didn't have names for yet. But I knew I would remember them, every single one. Because the truth is a beautiful thing. And when you finally find it, you never want to let it go. The deal was over. The life was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, the story was mine to tell. The spring in Texas doesn't arrive with a whisper. It arrives with a shout. The wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian blankets burst through the soil like they've been holding their breath for 100 years. The air smells of damp earth and new grass. It's a clean smell, a hopeful smell. It had been 1 year since I stepped off that train in a dusty gray dress. 1 year since a man I didn't know offered me a deal that saved my life. I stood in the new schoolhouse. It wasn't much. Just a sturdy frame building Jed and the boys had raised in the meadow between the ranch and the town. But it had windows, large, clear windows that let in the morning light. There were 12 children sitting at the benches. Billy's younger brother was there. So were the children from the neighboring farms. They were looking at the chalkboard. They were looking at me. "Today," I said. I picked up a piece of chalk. I wrote a word in large, steady letters. Choice. "We need to speak about the power of personal agency," I said. I turned to face them. I wanted them to hear the weight of the words. "It is the most important lesson you will ever learn in this room. Every human being is born with the inherent right to choose their own path. But here is the truth. You cannot choose what you do not understand. If you cannot read, if you cannot think for yourself, your choices will be made by others. To be truly free is to have the intellectual capacity to weigh your options and take responsibility for the outcome. A life without choice is a life of servitude, but a life with informed choice is a life of dignity." Billy, who was sitting in the back helping me with the younger ones, nodded. He knew. He had felt the cage, and he had seen the key. "When we talk about freedom," I continued, "we aren't just talking about wide open spaces. We are talking about the freedom of the mind. You have a moral obligation to yourself to become the author of your own story. If you let someone else hold the pen, they will always write a version of you that serves them. Education is the process of taking that pen back. The room was quiet. The only sound was the wind humming against the eaves. I felt a sense of peace I had never known in Philadelphia. I wasn't playing a part anymore. I was Abigail, and I was home. Later that evening, the sun began its slow descent. It turned the sky into a palette of fire and gold. I walked back to the main house. Jed was sitting on the porch. He wasn't cleaning a rifle today, he was just sitting, watching the cattle move toward the evening water. I sat down beside him. The wood of the porch felt solid, permanent. "They learned well today," I said. "I heard," Jed said. He looked at me. There was a softness in his eyes that still caught me by surprise. "Billy told me what you said about the pen and the story." "It's true, Jed," I said. "I know it is," he said. He leaned back against the post. He took a long, slow breath. "Abigail," Jed said, "we need to talk about the past, verbally, so it doesn't haunt the corners of this house anymore." I waited. I knew this moment was coming. "I spent 6 years blaming Margaret for leaving," Jed said. His voice was steady. "I spent 6 years telling myself she was a liar and a thief, and she was. But I realize now that I was a part of that lie. I didn't give her a choice because I didn't know how to speak my own truth. I thought that if I provided the house and the land, that was enough. I thought that being a provider was the same as being a partner." He looked at his hands. "But I was wrong," Jed continued, "and I want to state the lesson out loud for both of us. We must understand that a relationship is not a transaction of goods. It is an ongoing dialogue of souls. A house is just a structure of wood and stone. A home is a place where two people have the courage to be vulnerable with one another. To hide your heart to protect it is to lose it. We have a moral duty to be honest about our needs and our fears. If we don't speak them, we are building our lives on a foundation of silence. And silence eventually collapses." I reached over. I placed my hand on his. His skin was warm, rough, real. "I spent my whole life being enough, but not important," I told him. "I thought that as long as I followed the rules, I would be safe. I thought that my value was found in how well I could disappear into a role. But you taught me something, Jed. You taught me that being seen is a human right. To have someone look at you, really look at you and say, 'I see you and you matter,' is the most healing thing in the world. We have a responsibility to be witnesses for each other, to validate the existence of the other person's spirit." Jed turned his hand over. He gripped mine. "I see you, Abigail Sterling," he whispered. "And I see you, Jedediah Coulter," I said. We sat there for a long time. The stars began to wake up, one by one. "Silas is gone," Jed said after a while. "The council voted to remove him today. The news about Harrison's ledger and Horace's letter. It was too much for the town to ignore. He's headed for Austin. I don't think he'll be back." "And Caleb?" I asked. "He took a train east this morning," Jed said. "I gave him enough money to get back to Philadelphia. I told him if he ever came back to Texas, he'd find out why we call this place Rattlesnake Flats." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Caleb was my blood, but he wasn't my burden anymore. "Jed," I said, "why did you stay that first day at the station? Why did you really offer me that deal?" Jed smiled. It was a small, honest smile. "Because you didn't look like a victim," he said. "You looked like a woman who was waiting for the world to catch up to her. And I realized that if I didn't step in, I'd be missing the best thing that ever happened to this land. I didn't need a wife because of a will, Abigail. I needed a wife because I was dying of thirst in the middle of a river. I needed someone to tell me the truth, even when it hurt." He stood up. He pulled me up with him. "We built this home on a deal," Jed said, "but we're keeping it on a choice. The choice to stay, the choice to grow, the choice to be Abigail and Jed." We walked toward the door, but before we went inside, I stopped. I looked at the dark silhouette of the schoolhouse in the meadow. I looked at the bunkhouse where the men were sleeping, now able to read the names on their own bunk crates. "There's one more thing we need to state, Jed," I said. "What's that?" "Identity is not a static thing," I said. I looked up at him. "We are told from birth that we are our names, our families, and our mistakes. But that is a lie. Identity is a dynamic process. It is the sum of the truths we tell and the actions we take every single day. I am not the rejected bride. You are not the lonely rancher. We are the people we have chosen to become through our commitment to one another. To believe that you are stuck in your past is to deny the inherent human capacity for change. We are the architects of our own character." Jed nodded. He leaned down. He kissed my forehead. It was a gesture of profound respect. "Then let's go build something new," he said. We walked into the house. The lamp was burning low on the table. Martha was there, knitting by the fire. She looked up and smiled. "You're late for tea," she said. "We were busy being architects, Martha," Jed said. Martha chuckled. "Well, sit down. The world will still be there tomorrow, but the tea is hot now." I sat down. I looked around the room. I saw the books on the shelves. I saw the ledgers on the desk. I saw the man I loved, and the woman who had become my mother. I was Abigail Sterling. I was a teacher. I was a wife. I was a partner. I was home, and in the great wide West, under the infinite stars, that was more than enough. It was everything. The deal was done. The truth was told. The future was wide open. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the wind. I knew exactly where I stood, on honest ground. This channel is dedicated to stories of the Western frontier: cowboys, prairie love, motherly tenderness, human mercy, compassion, and the quiet beauty of people helping one another. If you enjoyed this journey, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and let this Western heart keep beating. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
As the dust settles over Rattlesnake Flats, Abigail Sterling's journey leaves us with more than a tale of the Old West. It leaves us with a truth that reaches far beyond the prairie, beyond the ranch, and beyond the time of cowboys and frontier towns. This is a story about dignity. The kind of dignity no insult, no rejection, no cruel judgment, and no false name can completely take away from a person who refuses to surrender their soul. Abigail arrived in Texas as a woman unwanted by one man and misunderstood by many others. She carried shame, fear, and a secret heavy enough to break her. But instead of letting the world define her by her lowest moment, she chose to stand, to work, to teach, to protect, and to love with honesty. The lesson of this story is that a person's worth is not measured by age, beauty, wealth, social standing, or even by the mistakes they once made. True worth is revealed in character. It is shown in the courage to tell the truth, the willingness to serve others, and the strength to build something good after life has torn everything down. Abigail teaches us that education is not only about letters on a page, it is a key to freedom. When people learn to read, to think, and to understand the world around them, they are no longer easy prey for those who use power in darkness. Knowledge becomes a lantern, and with that lantern, even the poorest and most forgotten souls can find their way to justice. Jedediah Coulter's journey is just as meaningful. He reminds us that strength is not found only in a steady hand or a fearless heart. Real strength is the ability to change, to listen, to respect another person, and to admit that love cannot grow where pride rules. His home was saved not only by land, law, or inheritance, but by partnership. He and Abigail built something greater than a marriage of convenience, They built a home on respect, consent, trust, forgiveness, and shared purpose. And that is the heart of the story. A true home is not simply a roof above our heads. A true home is a place where we are seen, heard, valued, and allowed to become our truest selves. This story also reminds us that the law without justice can become a weapon, but truth spoken with courage can turn the tide. Silas Vance used confusion, fear, and technicalities to control others. Abigail used memory, wisdom, and moral courage to expose him. Through her, we see that compassion is not weakness, and honesty is not softness. They are powerful forces. They can defend the innocent, restore dignity to the wounded, and bring light into places where corruption has lived too long. So, when we leave Abigail and Jed standing on honest ground beneath the wide Texas sky, we carry with us a simple but lasting message. We are not prisoners of our past, our names, our wounds, or other people's judgments. We can choose truth. We can choose kindness. We can choose to learn, to forgive, to stand beside one another, and to build a life worthy of respect. In the end, the greatest frontier is not the land stretching beyond the horizon. It is the human heart, and the courage it takes to make that heart honest, compassionate, and free.